Jesus' name, amen. Verses 1 through 3 we want to consider tonight, but in verse 3 we read, "He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. We hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not." There was a man, and he had a very, very important job, a very important duty. He had this duty in a local town, and it was really his duty to raise and to lower a drawbridge over a river, because there would be a steam train would pass by, and obviously he needed to raise and lower the drawbridge as the steam train would be coming. But one different day, his son decided that he would visit him at work. Go and see his dad just at work. It was summer, a bit like it is now. The son had no school, and so he decided, well, I'll go and see Daddy just while he is at work. And of course he went and saw his dad in a little station just underneath where the drawbridge was, and obviously where you could see the trains coming, etc. And as he began to look at all of the buttons and all of the knobs that were on before his father, of course he grew curious. And then he turned around, and there was actually this trap door. And he opened the door, of course, being very, very curious. And as he opened the door, he could see an awful lot of machinery. And of course, this machinery is very, very important when we think about the raising and the lowering of the bridge. There were the gears, really, of the thing. The gears were in this trap door. And suddenly, just as he grew more curious and begun to kind of fiddle around, etc., he lost his footing and he actually stumbled into the gears. And so the father, I'm sure you can imagine, tried to get him out, but he was stuck on really one of these gears. And as he tried to get his son out, he heard a whistle. And that was the whistle, obviously, then of an oncoming train. And he knew that the train was going obviously very fast. This drawbridge needed to be lowered. Otherwise, the whole train was going to perish, everybody in the train was going to lose their lives. So the father had this very, very, very sober and very solemn dilemma. As the train was growing closer, do I save the people and give my son in death? Or do I save my son? And sadly, all those people will lose their lives. He tried again one more time to free his son. And eventually then he had to engage the lever that brought the drawbridge down. Now I want you just to picture the scene of those who were on the train. Those who were on the train were obviously laughing, speaking with each other. They had no idea what was happening. Their lives were going on just as normal. They were enjoying this train ride, but all the while they didn't know. They didn't know that the bridge keeper had chosen to give his, at that time, only son to save and rescue their lives. And so really their lives, unknown to them, and cost his only son. And here in Isaiah chapter 53, as I've said, we have one of these glorious pictures, these portraits of the servant of the Lord, of the first coming of Jesus Christ. And of course, straight away we have God the Father giving his only son to those who really, in many ways like the story, those who were essentially clueless as to what was going on. I say that they were clueless because of what we have already read tonight. He was despised, we hid our faces from him, we esteemed him not. And really what that's getting at, without wanting to go into too much detail, what that's getting at is the fact that Jesus Christ was just, in many ways, as people were looking at him, just an ordinary man. There was nothing special about him. There was nothing that stood out about this coming Messiah, the fact that he was God manifest in the flesh. And all the while in Bible times, and of course it's still the case today, people were just living their lives oblivious to the fact that God the Father would give his only son to die for them. Verse 3, we hid, as it were, our faces from him. We esteemed him not. You may not be aware, but this chapter is one of the 4 songs of the servant, or servant songs. In other words, as Isaiah begins to look forward to the first coming of Christ, as he prophesies of the first coming of the Messiah, the anointed one, the chosen one, there are these servant songs, these songs about one who's going to come and serve mankind. In Isaiah chapter 42, chapter 49, chapter 50, we have the first 3 servant songs. And then chapter 52, verse 13, of course we read there, "Behold, my servant shall deal prudently." Right to the end of this chapter, chapter 53, verse 12, we have this 4th servant song. And what you really read in those servant songs is a portrait of a servant, someone who's going to come, someone who's going to give their lives, someone who's going to be the servant of the Lord. And yet, as we read in this last servant song, one who, whilst he would give his life in service for those whom he would come to minister to, yet really, the nations, the people of Israel at that time, they would horribly mistreat him. They would slay him. They would give him over to death. They would despise him. They would reject him. And yet ultimately, folks, and here's where the triumph comes in. It says in verse 11, that his righteous servant, my righteous servant, shall justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. He shall see of that travail, and he will be satisfied. Ultimately, although the servant was despised, and although the servant was rejected of men, he would ultimately be triumphant. He would triumph. And tonight we ask you the very simple question: are you a servant of the Lord this evening? Can it be said of you, as it was said of the apostles in the New Testament, these are the servants of the Most High? Here we have this servant of all servants. We have the one who would say when he was alive, "I am among you as he that serveth." In Mark chapter 10, we are told that he gave his life as a ransom for the many. He came not to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom. Here we see a wonderful portrait of a servant of which there is absolutely no equal. One who, whilst was God, yet in a very real way, looked no different to you and I this evening. Because the people of then didn't, by and large, didn't even recognize. There was nothing standoutish about him. He was not a celebrity. He didn't come wearing a crown, until, of course, they placed a crown of thorns on him mockingly. He didn't come as a king of splendor. No, from the moment he was born, as he was born as a lowly servant in Bethlehem, he came as a servant. And have you placed your life under the jurisdiction of this servant this evening? Are you a servant of the Lord, of Christ? The one who served to save you. Are you submitted your life to him? Or are you like those whom it was prophesied of here? Are you snubbing the servant, despising him, hating him, rejecting him? Or just simply going on about your daily business, just like those people on the train, and really oblivious to it all? Yet all the while he has came to give his life a ransom for you. Let's look tonight at just the life of Christ as we find it here under the heading, the Servant Men Snub. In verse 1, I want you to consider his activity. His activity. Look at verse 1 again. Who hath believed our report, and to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? And really what you have here in Isaiah is a statement or a question of wonder. Who's believed this record? That's what term report means here, a record. And when you think about it, what is he really getting at here? He's getting at the record, the future record of the deeds and mighty acts of the servant. How do you remember a servant? You remember him for what he does. In the natural realm, you say, well, there's someone who's lived the life of a servant. You remember them through what they do. Now, what mighty acts this servant did. You say to me tonight, well, where do you get his activity? Well, that's really where the arm of the Lord comes in. You think about the arm of the Lord, and really, the phrase the arm of the Lord in the Old Testament, it speaks to us of activity. It has with it the picture in our mind of God, as it were, or of this servant literally rolling up his sleeves, bearing his arm, and getting to work. I could go through the Old Testament tonight to prove this too, but just one verse I think will suffice. Isaiah 40 verse 10, "Behold, the Lord will come with strong hand, and his arm shall rule for him." Another prophecy of the coming Messiah. And the thought really here is this, in verse 1, is that Isaiah, he's bewildered. he's left scratching his head, as we would say. He's bewildered at the fact that this one who would come to serve, that no one really, or very few, would believe the record or the report of him, that he left through his mighty deeds. So he's getting really here at the power of Christ. His power. His power displaying then his deeds. Now you think about this for a minute. How powerful was Christ? You tend to think of Christ as a man, and we'll get to that in verse 2. We'll get to his appearance, but we tend to think of Christ in his humanity, and we kind of limit him, and yet we sometimes divorce that from the fact that he was God. That this man from Nazareth was literally there before it all began. Creation. Genesis 1 verse 1. In the beginning, God created. And the term God there, it's in the plural. And what you have there is a picture of the Trinity in creation. Father, Son, and Spirit. There you have God the Father, God the Son, God the Spirit there in creation. This man of sorrows, this man, he was there before it all began. You think of how he gave life to the dead. Think of how he healed the incurable. Remember, leprosy was a disease that you just had no cure for in Bible times. The mighty acts, the mighty deeds of this servant. And yet, in spite of that, Isaiah here, he's bewildered at it. Who's believed the report? To whom of the arm of the Lord is revealed? This arm has come, and it is, as it were, borne a wonderful testimony to the fact of who he is, the fact that he is God. And yet very few believe the record. And perhaps this is you tonight. In spite of the power of this servant, you're still snubbing him. In spite of all that Christ has displayed whenever he was here on earth, you think of all that Christ did when he was on earth. And when you actually begin to think about it, you sometimes wonder, how do men ever reject him? And yet men do. Maybe that's you tonight. Someone literally gave sight to the blind. Today, look at me, for example. I go to Specsavers once a year because my sight is getting worse. And the only way to cure it is to put these lenses on my head, and I'm sure many of you face the same. There's nobody who can just not even touch my eyes and give me perfect vision again. Oh yes, they can try, and they can doctor, and they can try and preserve and give laser treatment, etc. But you think about John chapter 9, that man who couldn't see from birth. And all of a sudden he's walking around there, and he sees. And the Pharisees, they call him in to question him, because of course they're curious as to how this all happened. They want to validate the facts that he of course was blind from birth. They bring his parents in. How on earth is it that this man really, could he not see from birth? That shows you the mighty deeds of this servant. And yet I just wonder tonight, in spite of the fact that he is God and he displays that through his mighty deeds, you're still snubbing him, still despising him, rejecting him. Think of some of the other wonderful mighty deeds of Christ. Think about the fact that he's power over nature. Mark chapter 6, verse 48 there, the disciples they're in the midst of the Sea of Galilee, the Lake Gennesaret. It's known for its storms, it's known for its blustery winds. They're in the midst of a storm, and all of a sudden Jesus just, as it says there, he just rebukes the storm. And the disciples, even themselves, even though they're followers of Christ, they sit there and they say, what manner of man is this? Even the winds obey him. What manner of man is this? I only thought about this week. Think of Christ on the cross. And there it is, it's midday. And all of a sudden, there's darkness that comes over the land. There's complete darkness. Who was it that brought the darkness at that precise hour? The very one hanging on the cross. And there they were, crucify him, crucify him. There they were mocking him. There they were despising him. And he has literally just called darkness over all the land at midday to show the blackness of sin that was laid on him for all of his people. What manner of man was this? You even think of Matthew chapter 17. Jesus tells Simon Peter, verse 27, to go fishing. Whenever he would go fishing, there was a fish already prepared with a coin in its mouth. And providentially, through the power of the servant of the Lord, Simon Peter would catch that specific fish with that specific coin in its mouth. And he would bring that fish to Jesus. And my, how he would teach him a wonderful lesson. He was to pay his temple tax with it. Again, on the cross, although in many ways people saw him as a weakling on the cross. There he is, the Messiah, but now he's dying. Matthew 26, what did Jesus say on the cross? Verse 53, thinkest thou that I cannot now pray my Father, and he shall presently give me more than 12 legions of angels? In other words, if he wanted to, he could call 12 legions of angels to come and remove him from the cross at an instant, but he chose not to. What mighty acts, what mighty deeds were done by this servant that could have been done by this servant. And yet, in spite of it all, and of course this shows you where grace comes in spite of it all, Christians, they look on, they see with the eye of faith exactly who this servant of the Lord is. And yet, all you need tonight, my friend, you need God to open your eyes in Jesus Christ and to reveal himself to you. Because we ask the question humanly, how is it that you can look at all of these things and think of all these things and even think of the fact that he said in Matthew 28 that all power is given unto me in heaven and in earth. All power. And we have seen that. And yet you still slight him. You still despise him. You still reject him. You know, whenever John Newton, the old converted sailor, of course, wrote Amazing Grace, whenever he was older and well past retirement age, he still insisted on preaching. He was barely able to stand. And when he would have an engagement, he would try and hobble up the steps or hobble to the platform. It got to the stage where he barely even had a voice. A bit like me a few weeks ago. He barely had a voice. And he would bring an assistant to come. And as he would speak, nearly like an interpreter, he would speak and then the assistant would beef it up with volume. And on one occasion he was speaking, and he said, Jesus is precious to me. Of course he said it so quietly, and there's no PA systems in those days. And the assistant couldn't even hear him. And so he said it a little bit louder, Jesus is precious to me. And the assistant, he still couldn't hear him. And so with all of the strength that he could muster, he just got up and he shouted, Jesus is precious to me. Can you say that tonight? That whilst God has given you breath, can you say that the servant of the Lord is precious to me? And when you think about his mighty activities, you could and you should be able to say that. His activities. Think with me secondly about his appearance. Look at his appearance here in verse 2. He shall grow up before him as a tender plant, as a root out of dry ground. He hath no form nor comeliness. When we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. Verse 1 speaks of him as God, his deity. Verse 2 speaks about him as man, his humanity. And it's a very, very interesting way in which it's described, the appearance, the coming of Christ. He's described here as a tender plant and as a root Out of dry ground. The term root here, out of dry ground, it really has the idea of a small, insignificant, unwanted root. What do I mean by that? What does the scriptures mean by that? Well, whenever you plant a new tree and it begins to spread roots, sometimes after a little while you'll see a little sapling or a little sucker that shoots up from the root. And it's really an unwanted thing. It's really a small, insignificant thing. It's not the tree itself that's growing, but it's kind of like a little sucker, a little sapling. And what's it doing? It's actually drawing strength. It's drawing nutrients from the root. And that's the idea here. It's very specific, the Hebrew word here. It really, some modern man has translated as a sucker. Something that just small, unwanted, you don't want it, you remove it, it's taking strength from the root. It's a small shoot, and it disfigures and it takes the sap and the nutrients from this tree or bush. It's unwanted. And that's how the coming of Christ is described here. Small, insignificant, despised. And it's very interesting here because it's called a root out of dry ground. Out of dry ground. And what's that getting at? That's getting at how Jesus was born and of course how in many ways he was unwanted. He was small in the sense of great births and great lives lived in that day. He was a small thing, he wasn't important. But he was called a root out of dry ground. And that is getting at the fact that whilst he was born in Bethlehem, he was raised in Nazareth. The dry ground here is Nazareth. See, Nazareth was dry ground. You remember what Nathanael said whenever he heard about the Messiah? Jesus of Nazareth. Can any good thing come out of Nazareth? Nazareth was known as an area where the unlearned came from, where the ignorant came from. And so here is this little shoot, this little sapling coming from dry, parched ground. The parched ground of Nazareth. And yet this is how Jesus Christ's birth and life, growth, development is described. No form or comeliness about him. And in the Hebrew, the idea is of a plant that's on its last legs, withering away. You get the idea that there's something here, there's nothing outwardly beautiful, nothing outwardly magnificent about it. It's just a small and despised thing. And yet, this small, this despised Messiah, who, and I say this reverently, would have looked like just an ordinary Arab. There would have been nothing extraordinary about Jesus Christ in terms of his appearance, in terms of his comeliness. There was nothing that would have stood out to make him shine. You know, sometimes you get this idea, maybe there's a glow about him or something angelic about him. Nothing of the sort, folks. He was just, in many ways, an ordinary man, but he was the arm of the Lord, verse 1. He went about doing much good. As Acts chapter 10, as Peter said in the house of Cornelius, he was anointed. Jesus of Nazareth was anointed, set apart. He was the Messiah, and he went about doing much good. And perhaps that's why you are rejecting him and slighting him this evening. He was from an ordinary place. In terms of his outward appearance, he was extremely ordinary. Just a man. Just a man. Oh yes, he's described as the King of Kings, but he's also described as a shepherd. A shepherd. Here we see that this king, he was a shepherd king, he was a real man, but there was nothing glorious in terms of his earthly appearance. He wasn't a king, he wasn't a celebrity, and we make no apology for that this evening. Maybe that's why you're not trusting him. Because when you think about all that he could do, think about his mighty arm, you expect him to, just like many did in Bible times, you expect him to walk about in great pomp, in great ceremony, maybe have the robe on him, maybe have a crown on him. And yet, he was just a root out of dry ground. Just a root out of dry ground. Oh yes, when it came to his crucifixion, then men mocked him as the King of the Jews, didn't they? You think about that scepter even that they gave to him. It's just an old piece of wood, probably a stick or something. How they took the crown of thorns, mocking him, and riven and drove that crown of thorns into him. How they took the other emblems, and they just essentially adorned him as a mock king. They had a mock coronation for him. Oh yes, we rightly remembered the coronation of our queen and the jubilee, etc. When you think about Christ, his appearance was the exact opposite. The King of Kings came as a shepherd. You think of what the scribe said to him about him on the cross. He saved others, let him save himself. What contempt they had for him. Remember how he was even treated in the synagogue in Nazareth, whenever he went back home, as it were. Matthew chapter 13, verse 54, when he was come to his own country and taught them in their synagogue, insomuch that they were astonished and said, Whence hath this man wisdom, these mighty works? Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not this his mother called Mary, his brethren James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? And you can see just the utter contempt that they had for him. And really what they're doing is they're struggling in their minds with this conflict of the fact that he was just the carpenter's son, just wee Jesus, raised in Joseph's carpenter's shop. And yet they couldn't imagine the fact of these mighty works. The rumors of the healing of the blind. The rumors of the healing of the lepers. The rumors of the raising of the very dead. He was just a little tender plant, wasn't he? Maybe that's you tonight. You look at the humanity of Christ and you focus in on it. You forget about the deity. You focus in on his humanity. The fact that he was just a man. And he was just a man in a sense. He was God manifest in the flesh. But he was a very real man who sweated, who wept, who knew what it was to cry. You say he was just a man. And you're divorcing the fact that he was God. He was God manifest in the flesh. The story was told by missionaries who were witnessing to Hindus and trying to get them to understand this great truth of the incarnation, of the coming of Christ into the world. And they were really struggling with it. God becoming a man, stooping to become a man. They just couldn't get it. And all of a sudden, there was an anthill. Of course, an anthill full of ants. And just near to the anthill, there was a stream. And this stream was bursting its banks, and the water was heading for the anthill, was going to destroy the anthill. And in Hindu mindset, a God is everything. All creatures are part of God. All creatures are part of God. And the Hindu immediately thought to himself, if only I could become an ant and warn the other ants about this coming stream. And then it dawned on him what the missionaries were saying. God became a man in Jesus Christ. Came to save them and to warn them from the wrath to come. And that's why he came. His activity, his appearance. Lastly and quickly, just think with me about his anguish. Verses 3 and 4, he was despised, rejected of men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. We hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, we esteemed him not. Surely he hath borne our griefs, carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. From the cradle to the grave, his life was marked by sorrow. Think about it, even his very birth. The birth of Christ should have been a joyous occasion for Joseph and Mary. You ever think about the birth of Christ, what happened? His mum and dad had to move to Egypt because there was a hit out on their son. They had to fly to Egypt for 2 years because Herod ordered the death of the firstborn. Even from his very birth, even from the cradle to eventually the cross, his life was marked with anguish. Never mind his death. As I've said, verse 4, really you get into his death. But even his life was marked by anguish. Think about his temptations. Tempted more than you and I ever will be. Hebrews 12 verse 3 tells us we are to consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, how he was rejected. Nobody likes to be rejected, do they? We live in a society where we like to be accepted. We like to have acceptance amongst our peers. Jesus was often rejected by men. His temptation. Of course, you could think about how in Gethsemane he sweat great drops of blood. Think about that. The weight of what he's about to do is bearing so heavy upon him that even the very blood vessels in his head now are beginning to burst, and he's sweating. This isn't his death. This is his life. What anguish he suffered in his life. And that is why Isaiah could say forcibly, just as he begins to speak about his death in verse 4, "He hath borne our griefs, carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, afflicted." Here was someone who knew what it was to have anguish, to have sorrow in their life. Sorrow more than you and I ever will. And yet, in spite of that, we esteemed him nothing. What encouragement for you tonight. You think of all the sorrow you face, ultimately because of sin in some form. Sometimes there's family, things creep into the family and there's sorrow there. Well, all sorrow stems from the fall in Genesis 3. Sorrow of death. Genesis 3. Death passed upon all men because of sin. Sometimes there are things happen in families. Why is that? Ultimately, it's because of sin. Every sorrow. That's why you read in glory that it will be a place of unparalleled and unbridled joy, because there's no sin in glory. There's no weeping in glory. All sorrow ultimately has become of some form of sin. And yet here we see, and we've sang about it already, verse 3, he was the man of sorrows, wasn't he? Here's someone who endured and encountered sorrow. Here was someone who knew what it was to suffer anguish, to suffer grief. And yet he bore, as it says there, in a lovely way, he bore them. He carried them. He not merely bore them and carried them, but he buried them. He buried them when he died. And then, of course, he worked the miracle of all miracles, and he was raised again, as Romans 4 puts it, raised again for our justification. The greatest miracle was the resurrection of Christ, when he conquered death and miraculously was raised to life so that you could be justified, to pay the penalty for your sin. In other words, he suffered the anguish of death so that you need not carry that load yourself. And that's what we remember in the table. That's what we're going to remember in a few minutes. The fact that the man of sorrows took all of the sorrow of sin in his own body, symbolized in the bread, and he gave it. That's what the blood speaks about, is sacrifice. Blood shedding, there's pain there. That's what we remember tonight. And I trust that you're not snubbing him, just as many were in Bible times, as many still do today. Spurgeon said, and with this I'm finished, he did not say the Lord of sorrows, but he said the man of sorrows. This is one of those gospel church bells that must be rung every Sabbath day. And we have rung that gospel church bell this evening. We trust that you're listening. May that you'll not be like those of verse 3. You'll hide your face and you'll despise him and receive him not. But may you'll receive him. You'll welcome him as the man of sorrows who died for you. We're going to close in prayer.